Good afternoon. I'm Natalia Muñoz-Rojas, and today I'm going to be talking about the Trascoro wall, or West Choir wall, of Palencia Cathedral, the subject of my master's degree dissertation. The Trascoro was commissioned by the Bishop Juan Rodríguez de Fonseca, a learned cleric and politician, and a key member of the court of the Catholic monarchs. It is located on the west wall of the choir, above the crypt of San Antolin, the patron saint of the cathedral. It is composed of a wall richly decorated with Gothic and classicizing tracery, the altarpiece of Our Lady of Compassion, acquired by Fonseca in 1505 whilst in Brussels, and 4 tapestries illustrating the Salve Regina anthem. Together with the altar, the bishop left detailed instructions for the liturgical rituals to be celebrated in this space. Fonseca's donation creates a beautiful ensemble in which the altarpiece of Our Lady of Compassion has a prominent role. I will talk about each component and their relevance, exploring how they work together to convey a strong statement about the bishop's power, his political allegiance, and piety. But before delving deeper into the Trascoro, I'd like to give a short introduction to the city of Palencia, the history of the cathedral, and of course, of Fonseca. Palencia is located in the northwest of Spain. It was one of Castile's most important cities in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, together with the cities of Valladolid, Burgos, and Medina del Campo. These were all important dioceses, seats of government, and some of the richest cities in Castile. For example, in the trade fairs that took place in Medina del Campo, you could find merchants from all over Europe who came to buy the highly sought-after merino wool that was then used for tapestries and other textiles, which were also sold at the fair. The Cathedral of Palencia is built around the crypt of Saint Antolin, an early Christian French martyr who, according to different sources, may have lived between the 1st and the 5th centuries. Out of all of the stories linking Saint Antolin to Palencia, the most popular one tells the story of how, whilst hunting, King Sancho the Great of Navarra chased a wild boar into a cave. When he was about to shoot his arrow, he became paralyzed. The king promised that if he was cured, he would build a church in that same cave. Once cured, and having found the relics of Saint Antolin in the cave, which had been forgotten there during the Moorish invasion, Sancho kept his promise and built what is now the crypt of Saint Antolin. The crypt was probably built before then, but this was the story which Fonseca seems to have preferred, since the staircase descending to the crypt, which was also built by the bishop, is decorated with this story. Given the already mentioned importance of Palencia during the Middle Ages, the small sanctuary grew into a large Romanesque church, and over the course of the 15th century, the building underwent drastic changes with the objective of enlarging the church further. It is at the turn of this century, at the beginning of the 16th century, that Fonseca was appointed bishop of the cathedral, and when we arrived to the building of the Trascoro. Juan Rodríguez de Fonseca was an extremely prominent member of the court of the Catholic monarchs. Born in 1451, he was Isabel the Catholic's confessor by 1484, having previously served as page at the court. Hernando de Talavera was his mentor, and he held important positions both in government, as First Minister of the Indies, and in the Church, having been the bishop of the cathedrals of Badajoz, Córdoba, Palencia, and Burgos. He was a prominent patron of the arts too, and amongst the numerous works of art he commissioned were an image of the Virgen de la Antigua for the Cathedral of Badajoz, in which he appears portrayed in prayer, and multiple books of songs for Córdoba Cathedral, all of which are decorated with his coats of arms and that of the Catholic monarchs. On the 2nd of January 1505, Juan Rodríguez de Fonseca was appointed bishop of Palencia Cathedral by the Catholic monarchs. At the time of his appointment, he was in Brussels, acting as ambassador in the Habsburg court, negotiating the marriages between the children of Maximilian of Austria and the Catholic monarchs. As mentioned, the cathedral was undergoing huge changes at the time. When Fonseca arrived in Palencia, the west end of the cathedral was unfinished, and the interior was yet to be furnished. Fonseca's coats of arms can be found throughout the cathedral, identifying the works he oversaw and paid for. He was responsible for finishing the remaining of the building, amongst which was the Trascoro. In order to finish the building, Fonseca appointed Juan de Ruesga as master mason, and proceeded to completely transform the layout of the church to make it even larger. He was tasked with enlarging the nave by an additional bay, allowing for more space for the new choir, which Ruesga would also build. This new choir, accessible only to the clergy, was to be surrounded by walls to isolate it from the nave. The Trascoro wall is the western wall of the choir. It is in the nave, facing the western portal. This architectural feature is unique to Spanish cathedrals. Whereas in the rest of Europe, the choir is often at the end of the church, next to the altar, in the Alps. In Spain, it is a sort of island in the middle, almost like a building inside a building. With such a placement of the choir, it became necessary for the exterior walls of it to be decorated and ornate, just like the walls of the nave are. Out of the 4 walls surrounding the choir, the Trascoro is often the most important one, since it faces the west portal, the main entrance of the cathedral. It acts almost as a second facade, first encountered by devotees immediately after entering the church. The newly built and bare Trascoro wall provided Fonseca with the opportunity to place his altarpiece in a site of much more prominence than a side chapel. Furthermore, the Palencia Trascoro stands out amongst others due to its position above the entrance of the crypt to Sant Antolin, the saint to whom the cathedral is dedicated to. The walls of the staircase, also designed by Ruesga, are built with similar stone as the ones used on the wall of the Trascoro, visually unifying both elements. By merging the entrance to the crypt with the Trascoro through the use of a similar design, the space became visually bound with the ancient and royal origins of the cathedral. The Transcoder Altar is made up of different elements I will now tell you a bit more about because I think they convey an interesting message about Fonseca. Firstly, the carved wall. As already mentioned, the wall was built and decorated by Juan Rodríguez between 1506 and 1514. The wall was left unfinished, and the standing figures and the reliefs were added at a later date. It is likely that only the central section and the architectural features were finished by the time Rodríguez died. The wall is divided into 5 vertical sections. The 2 outer sections are the narrowest, followed by the 2 middle ones, which are half the width of the central section, and which have 2 small doors to enter the choir. The central section of the wall is decorated with the most important tracery elements. Crowning this section is a polychromed wooden sculpture of Sant Antolin, looking down towards the staircase that descends to the crypt where his relics are kept. Beneath him are the coats of arms of the Catholic monarchs, flanked by their devices, a yoke and arrows, and they are held by St. John the Evangelist's eagle. St. John the Evangelist was Juan de Fonseca's patron saint. The fact that it is St. John's eagle which holds the monarchs rather than the more commonly found crowned eagle may indicate that through his patron saint, Fonseca desired to demonstrate his loyalty and support for the Catholic monarchs. Below the monarch's coats of arms, inside a smaller round arch, are Fonseca's coats of arms held by 2 angels. The space beneath that was left in reserve for the central panels of the triptych of Our Lady of Compassion, whose dimensions concord almost perfectly with that of its frame. The central section of the triptych of Our Lady of Compassion was likely commissioned by Fonseca to the Netherlandish artist Jan-Jules von Kalka in the early months of 1505, whilst acting as diplomat for the Catholic monarchs in Brussels. He is likely to have commissioned it at some point between January, when he was appointed Bishop of the Cathedral of Palencia, and May, when he returned to the Iberian Peninsula. The central section of the triptych is formed of 7 smaller panels depicting the 7 sorrows of the Virgin, placed around a central larger panel. The narrative begins with the bottom left scene and continues in a clockwise direction around the central panel, where it finishes. On the left side of the central panel are 3 scenes from Christ's infancy and the first 3 sorrows of the Virgin. These are the presentation at the temple, followed by the flight to Egypt, and Christ lost at the temple. Next are the scenes of Christ's passion. Christ on his way to Calvary in the middle, Christ on the cross, and below the descent from the cross and the entombment, the last of the Virgin's sorrows, and the moment where she becomes separated from Christ in his human body. The central panel testifies to the Virgin's pain. She is depicted on the ground with her hands crossed over her chest, held by John the Evangelist, whose red gown is draped over her shoulders, enveloping her. Most importantly, in the lower right corner, we see Juan Rodríguez de Fonseca, kneeling in solemn and humble prayer before the Virgin and his patron saint. Fonseca's final donation to the Cathedral of Palencia was made in 1524, the year of his death. In his will, Fonseca specified that Juan López de Calatayud, supposedly a merchant, was to go to Flanders to collect 4 tapestries of the Salve Regina, and he was to pay for them. In 1529, the tapestries arrived in Palencia. Though Fonseca did not leave precise information as to where they were to hang, an entry in the ceremonial accounts of the cathedral mentions that they were hung in the Trascoro. The tapestries illustrate the Marian antiphon of the Salve Regina, a song dedicated to the Virgin, Queen of Heaven and Mother of Mercy. The song is illustrated with images of people of different social backgrounds praying to the Virgin, Christ, and God. Measuring 6.5 meters in length, each tapestry is likely to have hung in the 2 bays preceding the Trascoro, between the pillars separating the central nave from the side aisles, forming an enclosed space within the cathedral. We do not know any other cases where tapestries were hung in this same manner, but it would be interesting to find out. There is one last element of the Trascoro, which I found very interesting. These are the wings of the retable. The interior of the wings consists of 3 golden inscriptions against a black background with a gilded frame. On the left wing, the inscription describes the 7 sorrows of the Virgin and provides information regarding the donor of the painting and the year of the commission. And on the right, the inscriptions narrate the conditions under which the triptych was commissioned and describe the forgiveness and indulgences that those who pray to the Virgin can receive, first in Latin and then in Castilian. The indulgences are linked to the papal bull granted to the Confraternity of the 7 Sorrows in Brussels in 1517. Juan Rodríguez de Fonseca had become a member of this confraternity whilst in Brussels, so he was probably aware of the new bull granted after he had left the city. Interestingly, the exterior of the wings is plain black, and the frame is not gilded, meaning that they were probably intended to stay open. This, combined with the fact that the pilasters behind the columns have 2 niches where small sculptures would have been placed, but that are now permanently hidden, and the niches are empty, could indicate that the wings were later additions and were not part of the initial design. I think they could have been added in 1522, when Emperor Charles V, a member of the Belgian Confraternity of the 7 Sorrows of the Virgin, visited Palencia. As part of the king's entourage, and acknowledging that the Monarchs was one of the confraternity's most prestigious members, Fonseca might have resolved to include the inscriptions about the indulgences in order to demonstrate his support for the king, much how he had demonstrated his support for the king's grandparents through the inclusion of their coat of arms on the traceries. As you can see, this is a complex space, a chapel created in the central nave using works of art of different mediums to convey a very precise message. The message becomes even clearer when we look at the altar together with the endowment left to the cathedral in November 1513 by Fonseca, when he left Palencia to become the Bishop of Burgos. In the document, he gives instructions for the use of the space and leaves a large sum of money to fund masses and finish construction works. He requested for an altar to be consecrated in the Trascoro and promised to donate the altarpiece. Following this donation, he emphasized that the altar should be referred to and dedicated to the Virgin of Compassion, revealing he wished to donate the triptych he had commissioned and wished to display it in a public setting. A Netherlandish panel such as this one would have reminded the viewer of the bishop's refinement. During the reign of the Catholic monarchs, and particularly within Isabella's court, Netherlandish art was highly popular amongst the nobility, becoming a symbol of refinement and wealth. Yet considering Fonseca's commission simply as a display of power is insufficient. It has often been argued that medieval patronage displayed an anxiety for one's salvation alongside as an opportunity to display status. In fact, contemporary accounts, such as the compilation of events linked to the Cathedral of Palencia, called Silva Palentina, describe Fonseca as a devout and generous man. Moreover, Netherlandish art had come to be considered a powerful tool whose realism aided religious meditation. In 1480, Hernando de Talavera had advocated the power of images painted in the Nueva Manera, referring to Northern Renaissance art painting. As his pupil and a learned member of the court, Fonseca is likely to have been familiar with Talavera's text. Above all, portraits and coats of arms were a powerful means of reminding people to pray for the salvation of the deceased. Fonseca's coats of arms are found throughout the carved wall, the staircase that descends to the crypt of Sant Antolin, and the bosses of the vaults above the space of the Trascoro. The strong reminder of Fonseca's pious bequest and the naturalistic image of the bishop in perpetual prayer would have prompted devotees to pray for him. As part of the endowment, Fonseca also gave specific instructions regarding the liturgical ceremonies of the Trascoro. He requested that Saturday Masses, previously celebrated in the main chapel, were to be celebrated in the Trascoro, followed by the singing of the Salve Regina. As part of the instructions, Fonseca also requested that all feast days dedicated to the Virgin had to be celebrated in the Trascoro. By stating that he wished all Marian Masses to be celebrated there, he made this space the focus of all devotion to the Virgin within the Cathedral of Palencia. As Mother of Christ, Mary was the most important intercessor for humanity, as it was believed that praying to her would ensure that your prayers would be heard. Praying to the Virgin for salvation was a common and deeply ingrained practice. Moreover, he stated that the clergy was to wear surplices and that they were to form two standing groups in front of the altar, leaving the crypt of Sant Antolin in the middle. If you look at the composition of the scenes unrolling in the tapestries, these are illustrations of how he wished the masses to unroll, with the Virgin in the middle, which in case of the altar it would have been the panel of Our Lady of Compassion, and the people praying to her on either side. The decision to place the altarpiece of Our Lady of Compassion on the wall of the Trascoro suggests Fonseca's desire to make a strong statement of power and status. The refinement of the ensemble demonstrated his riches, whilst the inclusion of the Catholic monarchs' coats of arms shows he was their loyal supporter. Yet it also communicates his anxiety for salvation. The open nature of the nave and Trascoro space implied that the altar was a space of public devotion. Unlike the choir and the main chapel, the nave and Trascoro would have been accessible to all. Fonseca was aware that placing an altar in the Trascoro would increase the visibility and prominence of his donation, ensuring an audience who would pray for the salvation of the donor, prominently represented in prayer on the altarpiece.